6 of the trial, we called Officer Main from the Rowlett Police Department. David Main helps us with a motive in this case by telling the jury what he finds there at the crime scene. One of the things that he finds is insurance policies on the lives of these 2 boys. We know shortly before these murders occurred that the Routiers go to a local bank and try to obtain a $5,000 loan. And the bank turns them down. Each boy was insured for $5,000. That's one method, one way out of this jam.
Sully, Jones, and Johnson.
I'm back, baby.
And this is Kitchen Table Research, where we do the research so you don't have to. This case has an extensive library of evidence, photos, and information, all located on our Instagram account, Facebook, and of course, our new website. Our website link can be found on our Instagram and Facebook bios. I still would love to send anyone that rates, reviews, and subscribes to Kitchen Table Research a small gift. So if you do that, go ahead and shoot me an email at kitchen.table.research@gmail.com. And we actually have a few new subscribers for for this episode. I'm going to give a shout out to Joe Bryan 54, and I just saw in our email that we have another new subscriber, so we'll shout you guys out in our next episode. And speaking of that, we just want to tell all of our fans, thank you so much for supporting us. We have over 1,000 downloads now, so we know that our podcast is getting out there and getting to your ears. And today we have Darlie, episode 3. Today it is my job to present the prosecution side of this case, and I have a personal goal to convince you that Darlie is guilty. I am going to place a trigger warning up front. We have the murder of 2 children, and we are going to talk about suicide. So if that's a trigger for you, and if you've listened to the other episodes, you kind of know what we're going to get into. So let's go.
We're going to get into the children's autopsies and everything. So
yeah. So if that is upsetting to you, please go ahead and you can either skip that part or skip this episode, but this case is basically surrounding the murder of 2 children, and so if that's a trigger warning for you, this might not be the best case. But at any rate, in the last episode, we introduced some players, and I'm going to have Jones kind of wrap up the last episode and get us started for today.
In the last episode, we talked about Judge Sully, who we speculated about his frontal lobe dementia, and ended with the murder/suicide of his own daughter. That's Judge Tull's daughter. The prosecutors, Greg Davis and Toby Shook, who saw the Darlie Routier case as a big case to prosecute, and the intent to make a name for Greg Davis especially. We also talked about the defense, Mad Dog Mulder, and Richard Mosty, the attorney from Kerrville. Kitchen Table Research also wrote our own opening statements, which consisted of info from the original trial and all the info we know as of today. In this episode, we are going to go through the prosecution's evidence and testimonies, as well as talk about how they processed and interpreted the forensics. In the next episode, we will discuss the defense's evidence. And as promised in the last episodes, we're going to get into interesting facts, theories, and conspiracies.
So, continuing from the last episode as the prosecutor, Sully is going to be our lead today. Once again, we are combining evidence from the trial and information that came out later on. And remember that we think Darlie's innocent, so our bias is probably going to show despite our best efforts. We'll start with Darlie's suicide note and the funeral before getting into the so good, so longed for forensics.
Finally, forensics.
Finally, forensics. We've got a lot of evidence to get through today, so shut it, Sully. and take it away.
Okay, well, I am going to touch on the suicide note that we talked about in episode 1. I believe Johnson read that letter to us, or parts of it. The prosecution is going to state that Darlie was suicidal, and therefore that could have given her the motive for homicidal and her own suicidal ideation. Here at Kitchen Table Research, we have a good team, and I will have Jones maybe jump in after I'm done with this, talking about what the difference between a suicidal ideation and a suicidal attempt is. So the prosecution is going to say that Darlie attempted suicide because when she made the attempt, she had the pills ready. None of them were taken out of the package, and she never actually took any pills, meaning that it was an ideation. And instead of her taking the pills out of the package, or her, doing something rash, she calls Darren and lets him know that she is not doing well. Instead, she wrote about her ideations in a diary. So, Jones, do you have anything else to say about the difference between ideation and attempts?
I think it's pretty obvious. An ideation is when you think about it, you may not have a specific plan, it's rather vague. Suicide attempt gets more concerning when you say, I have a gun, it's in my nightstand, it's cocked, and it's got bullets in it. And this morning after work, I'm going to go home and attempt this suicide. It's more about intent and do you really have the plan? I think when somebody says, I feel hopeless, I can see nothing good in my life, that is more of a bigger sign than, gee, I'm thinking about it.
Right. And I think I've mentioned this before, but I was diagnosed with a major depressive disorder, fairly moderate diagnosis. And, unfortunately, I've had suicidal ideations. I think almost everyone in life has. I think everybody gets to the point where they say, wow, wouldn't it just be easier if I went to sleep and never woke up? Or really, I know today that if I ever have those feelings, I do talk to my husband, and I know that they're fleeting feelings. And I really try and stay on top of my depression so that I don't get to that point. But I mean, I really do think that everybody, especially if you've had children and you've had postpartum depression, you've at least thought about it. And I think Darlie writing in her journal would be something that a therapist would recommend for her to do, because after she writes in her journal and talks to Darren, at the same time she's quitting breastfeeding and she starts her menstrual cycle, which is a big deal after you've had a baby. And so I think that Darlie did the right thing. I think Darren did the right thing. We talked about in the last episode, I believe, that this information should have been thrown out of the court case altogether because the suicidal ideation happened 30 days or more past the crime, and so it shouldn't have been allowed into evidence. But because the original defense team didn't file a motion for limine, it was included. So does anybody have any other remarks regarding the suicide note?
Yeah, I have made several attempts in the past with my stuff.
And I'm really
I
proud of
think
you for saying that, because I think hearing other people say that they've had these feelings and thoughts can help other people in the future. So thank you, Johnson, for sharing your story. Go ahead.
I think it's important also to delineate between active and passive suicidal ideations.
Mm-hmm.
So there's passive ideation, like what Jones was talking about, like I just don't want to wake up tomorrow. And then I think what Darlie had was an active ideation where you actually have a plan in place, but no attempt has been made.
Yeah. Suicidal ideation, attempts, all these words can be very convoluted unless you are a part of the mental health world. And so if you are struggling with any of these, please go seek help and talk to your family, talk to people that you trust. And honestly, if you have no one to talk to, shoot us an email at kitchen.table.research@gmail.com and we can help you get set up with a crisis line.
Absolutely. There's even one that I still text from time to time. And there are also things like Discord servers
Mm-hmm.
for mental health where you can be as anonymous as you want and not have to actually, voice talk to someone.
I've actually...
What's the suicide hotline number, the new one?
It looks like now there's not even a number. If you call the 988, it will put you through to a crisis line. I was gonna say, when I worked at the mental psych facility, we had a crisis line, and I actually worked the crisis line. Not only did I work it, but I've called it several times. So I've been on both sides of that phone call, and I will say it is very helpful. If you are actively suicidal, call 911.
It's
Yeah.
embarrassing, but worth it.
And I think that the goal is to make it less embarrassing and for people to really come out and talk about it. And so, again, I'm proud of all three of us for admitting and talking about the fact that, unfortunately, as human beings, suicide crosses our mind from time to time. So, we're going to state that Darlie's suicide was a ideation and that she did receive help for it. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the Silly String tape. And this case has been called the trial by Silly String because 1 week after the murders, Darlie's younger sister Dana calls the news media because they are going to celebrate Devin's birthday at the gravesite. The news
And if you
media.
guys remember from episode 1, Devin wanted nothing more in the world than to be 7.
So the news media, they did come out and record video from the party. They recorded the family spraying silly string over the grave, listening to Coolio's hit song at the time, Gangster's Paradise, which was Devin's favorite song. To the public, this seemed raunchy and inappropriate. Not only that, but Darlie was wearing a tight-fitting top. Remember, she has triple D breast augmentation, and she's wearing short shorts, and she's smacking gum and just shooting silly string as if she has no care in the world. I have read quotes that state that Darlie was dancing on her children's graves a week after the murders. Do you guys have any input into the silly string, or do you guys want to get more into that tape when we come across it in the defense?
I just like to say that I hate that we have to talk about a woman's breast size because it
Um,
doesn't matter. But in this trial, it mattered to the jurors. So that's the
a
only
lot
reason
of
I bring it up.
people really seem to be tunnel visioned on Darlie's breast, which just seems very strange.
They're nice, but yeah, they're not focused in a nice way.
Yeah, I don't think the perception would be quite as alarming in today's world as it was back then. I mean, today plastic surgery is like run of the mill. Injections, Botox, all of that stuff. And so in today's world, especially after having children and breastfeeding all three children, I know a lot of women that get breast augmentations, but moving on. So, we are going to switch gears and talk about the night of the crime and what happens in the investigation of Devin and Damon after we left off in episode 1. We know police officer Waddell is first on the scene and he waits for another police officer, Officer Walling, for backup before the scene can be cleared. Devin has been pronounced DOA on the scene, and Damon and Darlie have been rushed to the hospital by ambulance. Early on, when Karen, who is the nurse and the neighbor across the street from the Routiers, she comes over to help before EMTs arrive. And because she is a nurse, she knows a lot of these EMTs. And so she says in her testimony that she saw Damon's body because she was standing with Darlie on the porch, and through the kind of the crack in the front door, she could see Damon laying at the base of the stairs in the kind of in the entryway. While Karen is there, they don't allow her in the house, but they do give Karen baby Drake. And so Karen takes baby Drake back over to her house, and while she takes care of Drake, Karen's husband gives Darren a new set of clean clothes because Darren is covered in blood, and the two men depart for Baylor Hospital, where Darren's family has been taken, or at least Darlie and Damon have been taken. Both Darren and Darlie admit in court testimony that they knew that both boys were dead before Darlie even left in the ambulance. So at this point, the parents know that their two children are dead. And the crime scene will be taped off by 2:45, according to the police, neighbors, and other witnesses. After Walling clears the house around 2:35, and before the scene is taped off at 2:45, in this 10-minute window, a black car is pulled over. And we are going to read the excerpt of Walling speaking about this in court.
So Jones will be acting as leading prosecutor Davis, and I am going to be police officer Walling.
And the first question is, what were you doing when you pulled over the black car?
Well, I was right along in this area here, and the vehicle was coming down here. I'm pointing at a map right now. And about when it got right along in here, I was in the street and I stopped it.
All right. Can you tell us what kind of car it was?
It was a dark colored sedan.
All right. How many people were inside of it?
I think there were 4.
All right. What did you do once you got the car stopped?
Since at the time I had a suspect description, I ordered everybody out at gunpoint.
All right. Let me just ask you. You said you had a suspect description, correct?
Yes, sir.
What was that suspect description that you had at the time you stopped this vehicle?
A white male wearing a dark colored ball cap, black shirt, and blue jeans.
All right. You got the car stopped now. Just pick up from that point, please.
Yes, sir. I stopped the car. I had the occupants, which there were 4, exit the car and place their hands along the hood of the car, at which time I identified them.
Were they males or females?
There were 2 white males, 1 black male, and 1 female.
All right. So you get everybody out of the car.
Yes, sir.
How was the lighting out there at that location where you had these people out?
It was pretty good. There was a street light nearby.
All right. What did you do once you got them out? What did you have them do?
I had them place their hands on the front of the car so that I could check them for weapons. I checked them for weapons, and I checked the interior of the vehicle for anything relating to this crime. I identified them.
I checked them for weapons and I checked the interior of the vehicle for anything relating to this crime. I identified them. How did Walling identify them? He looked at their licenses. He called.
So let me jump in. Okay, so when Walling says that he identified them, to my knowledge, I have never read nor found, nor was he asked in trial how he identified them. To my knowledge, he pulled out the ID, said, "Oh, this is Anna Sully. You look like her. There's your ID back." To my knowledge, he did not call in their driver's licenses, or at least the driver's, nor did he call in the license plate on this vehicle. So when he says, "I identified them," to my knowledge, he identified them only by checking their ID against their persons.
Know that one of them was a woman. We know that one of them was black. So that leaves 2 other people. And we don't know anything about those people.
Not to my knowledge. I've never read anything about them.
We just know that they don't match Darlie's description. And he lets
according to the police, because we know eyewitness testimony can be very shaky. As to our knowledge, there are 2 white males, but they do not match the description that they have from Darlie at the time, which the description is only, it was a tall white man with long dark hair
and a ball cap,
wearing black.
A black ball cap,
a black shirt and a black ball cap. Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about the 3 males. That's what you were looking for, a male, correct?
Yes, sir, a white male.
Any of the 2 white males then match the description that you had been given?
No, sir.
They were both wearing light-colored shirts.
Yes, sir.
Were any of them wearing ball caps?
No, sir.
Did you look at the occupants to see whether you could see any blood on these occupants?
Yes, sir. I looked individually at each one, made them show me their hands, front and back. I looked up and down their clothes, checked their shoes by looking at them.
And what did you see?
I didn't find anything.
What about the outside of the vehicle?
I examined it and I didn't find anything.
Did you look inside the vehicle?
Yes, sir, I did.
Did you see any blood inside the car?
No, sir.
Okay. How about any clothing that might match the perpetrator? Did you find any dark t-shirts, any dark ball caps, any other clothing inside the car or trunk?
No, sir, I didn't.
Okay, so what did you do once you finished the search of the occupants? You identified them and you completed the search of the vehicle. And what did you do with them?
I released them.
So, the prosecution believes that these four individuals had nothing to do with the murder, that they just coincidentally happened to be driving through the neighborhood at 2:30 in the morning, which I mean is not out of the norm, but we're going to talk about the black car in length during the defense episode and also during our conspiracies. So, let's put a pin in the black car because we'll definitely be talking about it again. So, we're going to get back into the investigation that happened after everyone leaves for the hospital. EMTs are now off the scene, and several police are called onto the scene. And several police will testify in this trial. However, we're just going to take pieces of information that we think are important because mostly the investigation that the police did, every police officer's testimony matches, mostly everybody else's. So that morning, the police brought in a canine unit. The police knocked on doors. They speak to over a dozen neighbors. They jump over fences. They look under boat covers. They dump trash cans. They are looking for tire marks, cigarette butts, maybe trash, soda cans, beer cans, weapons, anything that this intruder might have ditched on his way out. And they will come across a piece of evidence that was ditched that I'm about to get into. While all the police are on the stand, the prosecution is going to talk ad nauseum about life-saving measures.
I'm sorry, did you just use Latin casually?
I actually have a pretty good amount of education behind me. So let's carry on. Was that an English or a Southern accent? I can't tell.
I don't know, but leave it.
So a huge question in this case that everybody comes back to is, did Darlie provide life-saving measures? So remember that from the time of the 911 call until police get there is only a couple of minutes. And in those few minutes, she did not seem to perform CPR. She did not stop bleeding as one would. She used wet towels instead of dry towels. And when the police asked her to hold towels over the two bleeding boys, Darlie does not do this. And so the prosecution is going to state that Darlie did not provide any life-saving measures, according to Walling, Waddell, and the EMTs that were first on the scene. And when Darlie gets to the hospital, another huge point of contention in this case is how bad were Darlie's wounds, and did that affect her behavior after the crime? So she gets to the hospital, Darlie. Again, I've already stated that she knows that both of her children are dead at this time, both Devin and Damon. Dr. Santos, who is the surgeon on call that night, says her wounds are, quote, superficial. And this word is used over and over again in this case, that it's quote unquote superficial. The doctors and coroners cannot definitively say if Darlie could have committed the stabbings, nor if she could have self-inflicted her own injuries. This is a major point of contention, and we're going to get into it in the defense, where Jones is going to give us her medical opinion. But as far as the prosecution goes, Darlie's injuries were not that severe. She could have performed life-saving measures, and her wounds were superficial. And so that leads the prosecution to believe that these wounds were self-inflicted. The nurses are also going to testify that Darlie was not upset or grieving in a typical way. She didn't want to hold the baby. She acted and put a show on when family and friends were there. They also testify that Darlie speaks obsessively about the crime, and she states over and over again that if she wouldn't have picked up the knife, could they have lifted prints from the murder weapon? And that when Darren was in the room with her, that she and Darren kind of kept going over and over and over the story to try and match stories. So we have about 5 or 6 nurses that are going to testify to this. Next, we're going to talk about the autopsies of the two boys. And first of all, the jury did not see any pictures of the boys at autopsy. I'm not quite sure why this happened. I don't know if it was because they were minors. I don't know if it's because their injuries were as such that they thought it would be traumatic to the jury. But one thing I do know from being a true crime aficionado is that at autopsy, the ME declares that Devin has been stabbed 4 times, 2 to the upper left chest, 1 to the left arm, 1 to the back of the left thigh, probably killing him immediately. She believed, this ME was a woman, she believed that Devin would not have lived more than 7 minutes due to blood that was leaking into his pericardial sac and lungs. So that means that one of the stab wounds went through his pulmonary artery, which goes to your lungs. And since it's an artery, when it was hit, it starts bleeding and leaking into these sacs that your heart is in a separate sac than your lungs are. That way your organs don't get all confused with each other. But he's bleeding into both of those sacs, and because it is an artery, he's going to be shooting blood. ME in this case believes that the stab wound to the left arm was probably Devin, even if he was asleep, out of self-defense. Maybe he raised his left arm or he turned and the stabber accidentally hit him in the arm instead of the chest. There's also abrasions and petechial hemorrhaging to the left neck. So
if you like forensic files, you know what petechial hemorrhaging is.
Oh yeah. And I'm about to explain it. So he has abrasions, probably from thrashing around while being stabbed. And again, like Johnson said, if you're a forensic files aficionado, then you know that petechial means that blood vessels have been kind of cut off. And what it looks like in an autopsy is kind of like spider veins. And we know that if you're choked, that petechial hemorrhaging is seen in the eyes. So he doesn't have any in his eye, but he does have petechial hemorrhaging around his neck. And so it's believed that at one point the killer put his hand on the left side of Devin's neck, and between all the evidence, we know that the killer was right-handed. Darlie was right-handed as well. But that at one point, she grabbed Devin's neck and to hold him down to stab him once again. So let's move on to Damon. So Damon was stabbed once to the left upper back, once to the right upper back, once to the right mid-back, and once to the lower right back. He also has an incision wound to the left shoulder and left upper back. This leads the ME to believe that he was sleeping on his stomach when he was stabbed. Either that or he woke up while Devin was being stabbed and turned over to crawl away or to try and get away from Darlie, the stabber. The ME believes that Damon was stabbed in 2 separate events, and it's believed that he maybe received 2 or 3 stabbings, and then the killer went on to do something else and then realized that Damon was not dead and went back and stabbed him again. So the ME cannot state the order of the stabbings, but it is believed that Devin was stabbed first, that he was asleep, and that he was stabbed in his sleep. Now Damon, like we said, might have woken up and might have tried to get away from the killer. And if you go online and look at our DNA map of the living room, Damon and Darlie's blood is all over the place, as where Devin's is really just located basically to where he is lying. It is believed that Devin was stabbed first and probably died nearly immediately, as he did have that pulmonary artery hit, and that Damon died after.
Well, and I think it's important when you look at the DNA map of the blood evidence all over the Routier downstairs, and it looks initially like Damon follows Darlie into the kitchen. And I've read since then that there was so much blood at the scene they think that Darlie probably tracked
Right.
blood into the kitchen, not that Damon actually got up and went to the kitchen. And it took me a long time to get that figured out.
The ME will state that Damon could have gotten up and walked because he was not hit directly into a bleeder, like an artery.
Right.
Instead, he had a slow internal bleed. He was bleeding more into his lungs. He could have gotten up and walked, and he could have talked for a very short period of time before he succumbed to his injuries. So, again, we said the jury was not shown pictures of the boys at autopsy. And I just wonder, I'm not sure why, because once they have the bodies all cleaned up and they're looking at the wounds, they normally take pictures of just that wound. So the jury wouldn't have had to see the crime scene of these two bloody children. Instead, they're looking at one stab wound at a time. And so I'm really not sure why. I believe because the defense didn't put it into discovery that the prosecution wasn't going to either. Do you guys agree with that? Johnson, will you tell us from your legal perspective, why wouldn't they have shown pictures of the boys, you think?
So I do think it's very odd that the prosecution specifically did not show autopsy photos because there have been studies done. I'm not sure if they were done at this point in time of the trial yet, but that when jury members see especially gruesome crime scene or autopsy photos, they are much more likely to convict just because they are outraged at the trauma that's occurred and they want justice. So I do think it's weird that the prosecution didn't use that advantage that they had.
And I'm not quite sure, but maybe her original defense team, Parks and Huff, maybe they did put in a motion of limine that the autopsy photos couldn't be shown. Another oddity in this case is that the ME's office nor the funeral home took prints of the boys. And this is going to come up later in appeals, but both boys will be exhumed, and they were both buried in the same casket. And when they exhumed them, because the family requested that the boys were holding hands, they could not get clear fingerprints off either boy. So we do not have accurate fingerprints of either Devin or Damon. And I think that's a huge mistake that was made at the medical examiner's office. Now, another thing that the medical examiner cannot speak to is if the knife, the murder weapon that Darlie picked up and placed on the counter, if that is the knife that killed both boys. They said that it's probable, but they cannot speak in definite. So the knife, Darlie probably used the knife out of the butcher block and probably stabbed Devin first and then went on to stab Damon. Then she walks off, realizes Damon is not dead, and then she comes back to finish him off. That is the belief of the prosecution and the medical examiner's office. Sidebar that I believe when we talked about the wounds and the stabbings in the first episode that we might not have accounted the incisions. And so this order of events is the true order that me and Johnson carefully double checked. So if we made a mistake in the first episode, I just want to say that this episode, or that what we just talked about, is straight from the autopsy report. So,
and always send us an email if you notice something we didn't.
Yeah, or if you have an answer to a question like we just had, why didn't they show the autopsy reports? If you work at the ME's office or if you work in a courtroom, let us know. Okay, Johnson, why don't you start us off into Finally Forensics? And let's talk about
Forensics.
Finally Forensics. And let's talk about Cron and Lynch.
Cron. You might remember Cron from our Betty Gore episode where he fingered Candy Montgomery. Because he's a fingerprint expert. Dirty Jones Dirty. He has been the leading fingerprint expert in Texas for a long time. and he has worked a lot of high-profile cases. Upon his death in 2019, the fingerprint card where Jack Ruby's fingerprints were matched to the gun that killed Lee Harvey Oswald were found among his personal belongings, the last real record of Ruby's prints. And for those of you who can't remember that far back, Lee Harvey Oswald shot Kennedy, right?
Assassinated
Yes.
him. Yes.
So the government says.
Mm-hmm.
Cron's best friend over at the DA's office is Henry Wade, and we're going to come back to him at the end of this episode.
And for those of you that don't remember that far back, so Oswald shot Kennedy, and as they were taking Oswald, or as they were arresting him or moving him,
They were moving him.
Jack Ruby shot and killed Lee Harvey Oswald.
Right. So that was 2 days after the assassination.
Right. And maybe one day we'll get into the assassination of Kennedy, because
Yes.
not only do I have an obsession with the Kennedy family as a whole, they have so many interesting stories throughout that family, but the assassination of John F. Kennedy is probably one of the most talked about, researched, and conspired about crimes in American history. Would you guys agree?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Why don't you introduce Lynch?
All right. For this section, we also have another returning character for the trace evidence. You might remember a dude named Lynch from the Kenneth McDuff case. He's back. But Lynch has also worked several other high-profile cases, such as the Curley and Green Davis cases. There are forensic file episodes on both of these for anyone who wants to know more. He also has several papers published through Texas Tech University.
Go Red Raiders! Moving on to our finally forensics. So, Cron, he is our fingerprint guy. He's going to come on the scene about 3 to 4 hours after the crime has been committed, around 5:45 a.m. that morning. He concludes almost immediately, roughly 20 to 30 minutes into his walk, that the scene had been staged. Cron implies Darlie threw the glass and knocked over the vacuum in an attempt to stage the scene. And he's going to talk about the mulch in the backyard, which we'll talk about here in a minute.
I'm very excited for mulch.
I mean, who knew that mulch could be so exciting?
And we're not being sarcastic.
Yeah, for real. This is a big theory that the prosecution holds. Let's just go ahead and get into it. So in the backyard there, and you, again, go look at our pictures on social media. In the backyard, it was dry, the mulch. So they kind of have these pathways leading through the backyard. They have the spa, so one leads out to the spa. Part of the window kind of has a walkway through it, and 2 of the windows sit above this mulch or landscaping that had been done back there. And so when Cron comes onto the scene, he first of all says, well, there's no footprints in the mulch, and the intruder would have taken the shortest route possible, which would have been walking through that mulch. And since there are no footprints back there, it leads him to believe that there could not have been an intruder.
We'll come back to the mulch in the next episode.
Yeah.
Episode
We're going to come back to
sorry.
we're basically going to come back to all the forensics in the next episode from the defense's perspective. So, Cron believes that this is a big point because the killer would have almost had to have walked through that mulch to go through the window that it's believed Darlie had staged. Again, this leads him to believe that the scene is staged. Along with that, there's no dust that's been disturbed along the windowsill, and so it really just appears that nobody walked through the backyard. And this is a big winning point for the Darlie did it enthusiast. Another point is Cron testifies that if he was fighting with Darlie, or if Darlie was fighting back, that he would have used indiscretions, or he would have cussed at her, or he would have called her a whore or a bitch or whatever. And because the intruder did not say anything to Darlie, that Darlie is making the story up. Charles Lynch, who arrives on the scene around noon, will briefly speak with Cron, and Cron reiterates his mulch and dust and that the scene was staged. And so Lynch clearly picks up on this and he is going to jump on the Darlie stage the scene / mulch bandwagon, and he will corroborate Cron's findings in court. And Lynch is also going to talk about trace evidence, as he is our trace evidence guy in this case. Like Jones stated earlier, he collects the serrated bread knife and he takes it in for testing. The murder weapon had not been put back into the knife block, and so it is taken off of the counter and bagged and taken to the lab, as well as the serrated bread knife that the screen was believed to be cut with. And I'm not quite sure, Jones, if it was cut from the inside or the outside. They don't ever say, because I believe that police walked through the screen or were looking at it before they could get somebody out there to tell them which way it was cut from, because police were walking through this screen before pictures and stuff were ever taken. Okay, so Lynch takes the knife block to his lab. When he analyzes the bread knife, he finds quote unquote fibers, which he matches to a sample of the exact screen that came out of the Routier house. This provided the prosecution with a narrative that Darlie used this serrated bread knife to cut the screen and put it back in the knife block. So moving on, we are still in the garage, and on that screen that we're talking about that was cut, a woman's blonde hair was found, and this hair is believed to be Darlie Routier's. Cron testifies that there is no blood or evidence found outside of the home, including the garage. Except, spoiler alert, there is evidence outside of the house that we will get into. Moving on from the garage, let's talk about the gate for a little bit. I believe in episode 1, we told you guys that Darren had gone out to fix the gate. It was quote unquote broken and it was dragging along the sidewalk or the concrete. And so Darren had gone out to saw the bottom of the fence so that the boys could come in and out of it easily. They did not have a lock on this fence. The police state that it is still broken and it's still dragging. And so the police have to kick the gate in to enter the backyard. And so the question is, how would an intruder have gotten in if the gate hasn't been moved? There's no footprints in the backyard. So, in my opinion, I don't think Darren fixed the fence. And I don't think he did this to be malicious. I think that he went outside and drank a beer and was like, I'll do this weekend or something. I just am going to sit out here and catch a break. What do you guys think about Darren fixing the fence and the whole fence fiasco?
His neighbor testified he saw Darren fixing it. Darren works in like IT, okay? He's not great at sawing and stuff. Maybe he just did a
And we've
bad job.
read that a neighbor corroborates that the gate, that Darren did fix the gate, but that's not ever stated in the court testimony. That neighbor never comes and testifies and says, yes, I saw Darren fixing the gate. So, I mean, does come from just police records or notes that the police had made, or you know what? I'm not quite sure where that piece of information is, so I can't back that statement. But because the police state that the fence is still dragging along the ground and that they have to kick it in, I just don't think Darren fixed it.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think.
Or they came in guns blazing and they were like, let's kick this gate in. And then they broke it. Or maybe they're weaker than a 7-year-old and just can't lift the gate. Which
or
is my
maybe
personal favorite.
the gate is just a hypothetical portal into
into the world of criminalistic behavior.
right? Into the criminal mind. So, again, speaking of the backyard, there was a motion light that should have come on for a time period of 18 minutes and was not on when police arrived. So, again, the intruder did not trip the security light. It does not appear that the gate had been broken or kicked in or opened at any rate. Although now that I'm thinking about it, what if Darren did fix the fence and, like Johnson just said, the police come in and just kick it down anyway?
which is possible because
Yeah, they do that.
they ruined everything in the house by
Oh my
cutting things
gosh.
out and taking out sheetrock and
I
all
was going to
that
say, in
stuff.
Darren's testimony, I believe there was something like $20,000 worth of damages done to the home that had to be repaired before he could put it up for sale. So, yeah, they had done extensive, and they
16
like
grand of that damage is just those curtains.
it's the Armani curtains. I do know that they looked in the plumbing to see if anything had been thrown down, like sinks or toilets. And when they removed all that plumbing, there was a ton of flooding and standing water in the house that needed to be fixed. So going back to the security lights, Walling and Waddell say that when they pulled up, that security light was not on, and the light lasted 18 minutes, meaning that Darlie would have placed this piece of evidence that we're about to talk about. She would have had to place that at least 18 minutes before police arrive on scene. There is a piece of evidence that is found outside of the home. It is a sock. We're going to get into the sock in the next episode because it really falls into the defense's arena. When you put all of these pieces of the puzzle together, so the security light has not been tripped, the gate doesn't look like it's been opened or kicked, the garage, there's no dust disturbed. We find out that the knife that it comes from inside the home is what cut the garage screen open in the first place. And so if you look outside of the home, there's really no DNA or evidence besides the sock outside of the home. But when you get inside of the home, there is quite a lot of evidence. And so now we're going to shift into the inside of the Routier home and the forensics that are found inside. And Johnson is going to introduce another character that will testify for the prosecution, and his name is Tom Bevel.
So Bevel is probably the most familiar investigator to you guys. He's worked on cases like the Valentine's Day murder, the staircase murders. And speaking of the staircase murders, there was an Easter egg for this case in the Murdaugh chatters, if you guys found it. He also worked on the Scream spree killings, the Scott Dunn case, and of course, the Murdaugh murders, which I literally just said. He's even talked about the Kennedy assassination. He's been on 8 episodes of Forensic Files. However, Bevel has had several incidents where his science has been appealed or questioned.
And he does seem to be a fairly prominent blood expert, but I think sometimes he steps outside of his area of expertise because he is a blood analyst. He is not a blood splatter analyst. Those two things are quite different. And honestly, if you go look into the Scream spree killings, that is the name of that is because that is what motivated the movie Scream, which has become a $1 billion horror enterprise. So I believe that there is a Forensic Files on that case. And if you just look up the Scream, quote unquote, spree killings, you can find it on, you can find that episode of Forensic Files on the internet. As soon as they enter the inside of the house, so they've gone from the back gate through the backyard, through the window the believed intruder would have gone through, and they enter the utility room door, and there's a utility room or a laundry room, and then there's a secondary door that leads into the kitchen. A lot of houses are set up like this, but again, you can go look at our social media, find a map of the house, which becomes very important if you really want to dig your fingers into this case. So on the door, and this is from the garage into the utility room, which we're going to refer to it as the laundry room, there is a bloody print on the door, and it's infamously named 85J. Now, this print has never come back to match anyone. Family, friends, police, anybody that was on the scene that night. The blood was Darlie's blood. It's matched to her. But the print has been deemed unmatchable by forensic experts. So the print that was left in blood cannot be matched to anybody.
Which, fun fact, what do you call a bloody print? It's a patent
Patent
print.
print.
Yeah.
Okay, so as we heard on the 911 call, and we've talked about, Darlie talks about the murder weapon or the knife on the 911 call. However, when tested, the material was not a conducive surface for print. Another print is going to be found on the coffee table behind Devin's body. It's like a sofa table. Again, you can see it on the map. And this print, again, has been left in blood. And again, same thing. It's unmatchable. It's a partial print, which means what, Johnson?
They can march part of it.
Yeah, it's like a
Match part of it. I was patting the cat. I got distracted.
and it's just a fragment, so they don't have a whole print. We've been talking about Tom Bevel, the blood expert, and he actually does not come onto this crime scene until October. So remember that this crime happened in June. Bevel comes on the scene in October because he and his lab is out of Oklahoma City, and then he will obviously come to testify at Darlie's trial at the beginning of 1997. So when Bevel comes to the Routier home in October, as we've stated, there's been flooding, there's been damages done to the house. God knows how many people have walked through the home. They decide that they're going to perform some blood experiments right on top of the crime scene. They go into the laundry room because there is blood in there. So not only is there the bloody thumbprint on the laundry room garage door, but there are circular drops of blood in the laundry room. And if you know anything about blood analysts, even again, if you watch Forensic Files, we know that a perfectly circular drop comes from slow moving or no moving motions. Say that you have stabbed somebody and you're standing with the knife down by your side and there's blood running off that knife, it's going to leave perfectly circular drops. Now, if you are bleeding or if you're carrying a knife that has blood on it and you're moving, that blood drop will become a directional blood drop and will be shaped in the direction that the blood is moving in. Original investigators in the utility room find only circular blood drops. And so Bevel decides he's just going to perform his experiment right on top of the crime scene. And the reason he's doing this experiment is because Darlie states that the intruder threw the knife in the laundry room before exiting out the way he came, so through the garage and out the window. However, there are several questions about this. The first one being, why would the intruder give the victim a weapon? The second is the knife is found on the kitchen counter. And Darlie does state, as you heard in our 911 call, that she did go to the laundry room where she was, quote unquote, following the intruder. The intruder threw down the knife. She instinctively picks it up and puts it on the counter. Now, there is no blood evidence that the knife was ever thrown down. So we'll have pictures of this, but in one place where the knife was set down in the living room on the carpet, there is a straight line that's about the length of the believed knife. There is not a line where it was quote unquote thrown down in the laundry room. And this is another piece of evidence that the prosecution will state that Darlie has made this story up. So Bevel tries this theory out right on top of the crime scene, as I stated, and he dips the knife in blood and he throws down the knife, and he cannot recreate any scenario in which the knife does not leave some type of blood evidence on the utility or laundry room floor.
Wait, he used actual blood?
He did not use actual blood, and you're actually supposed to use actual blood, or at least sheep's blood, and he couldn't get his hands on any, and so he uses paint. He also his camera quits working, which photography plays a massive role in this case, and it's not done very well. So we're going to get into that in the next episode. The prosecution is going to state that the knife was never thrown down in the utility room. Instead, Darlie set the knife on the counter before she called 911, and it never was thrown onto the laundry room floor. So Bevel will testify to this, and in his 8 episodes of Forensic Files, he does very thought out experiments. He seems very educated and knowledgeable about his field of expertise, and I watched all 8 episodes that Tom Bevel is in Forensic Files, and he does measurements and uses real blood and does a pretty good job. However, in the Routier case, I would say that he kind of lacks. He doesn't measure anything, and so we'll get into that when we get into the defense. But we want you guys to remember this utility or laundry room situation for the next episode. Speaking of Bevel, we're going to go ahead and move on to Darlie's t-shirt. Now, Darlie had gone to sleep that night in kind of a Victoria's Secret long t-shirt. It wasn't like lingerie or anything. It was a pink kind of v-necked t-shirt that hit her right above the knee, and she had on a pair of panties. So her shirt is taken off on her ride to the Baylor Hospital, and it is crumpled up and thrown into a brown bag, which then is taken to the fire department, where the paramedics take it after they have dropped Darlie off at the hospital. And so Bevel is going to analyze this t-shirt, and he's going to find microscopic blood drops with both Darlie and Damon's blood found on the right back shoulder of her t-shirt. And Bevel is going to testify that this is cast off from Darlie raising her arm over her shoulder while she stabbed Devin. And he uses 4 to 6 spots that make a pattern on the right shoulder that indicate that Darlie pulled the knife over her head to stab at least Devin. Damon's blood and Darlie's is found all over her t-shirt. Again, we'll have a picture of this, but her shirt is pretty saturated in blood. So Bevel takes a spot that has not been quote-unquote contaminated to do this experiment, and that spot is going to be on the right shoulder. Moving back onto the crime scene in the kitchen. So we've gone from the backyard, through the garage, through the laundry room, and we are in the kitchen now. There is a vacuum that has been tossed over. There is glass that has been shattered. So Helena, who you guys remember from our first episode, she had been there that day helping Darlie clean. She testifies that she left the pantry door, and so this vacuum has been turned over, and it looks like Darlie just pulled it kind of over and threw it down on the ground to look like there had been a struggle. There was also a wine glass that would have had to have been forcefully pulled from the rack to have been thrown down. So, you know those like wine racks where, like in bars and stuff, where they slide the base into like a rack and they hang upside down?
There is a picture of it on our website.
So the intruder would have had to pull that wine glass out and throw it at Darlie. So, I mean, again, why would an intruder do this? It just really doesn't make sense. And so, again, it seems as though Darlie has staged this part of the crime. And if the intruder is fleeing, he has time to pick up the wine glass and throw it down, and he also has time or decides he's going to throw the murder weapon and arm his victim. Those two things in Cron's mind just really don't make sense. Moving on to the living room. The prosecution states that if Darlie's neck had been slit on the couch, Darlie states that she was sleeping on the couch when the intruder entered. Well, there was not enough blood to show that her neck had been sliced on that pillow where she laid on the couch. And she's laying on her right shoulder which is up against the back of the couch. And so people who say, oh, well, maybe when Devin was stabbed, there was arterial spray that got on her shirt. Well, that's not possible because she was laying on that side of her shoulder. It's believed that Darlie slit her neck at the sink because after the family is out of the house and luminol is sprayed in that area, because the sink looks fairly clean. There's not a lot of blood at the sink, but once they spray that luminol, there is a ton of wiped off blood, and it looks like blood was dripping down the cabinets onto the flooring. It's all over the sink and counter, and all of that had been wiped up. And so it is believed that Darlie slit her neck over the sink, and that luminol, which again, if you're a forensic file enthusiast, what is luminol, Johnson?
It is a spray that makes, believe it reacts with the hemoglobin in blood and makes it like light up under a black light.
Correct.
Oh, you were just testing me? That's rude.
Yeah, of course. Of course. All right, so let's move on to the coffee table. So Cron comes in to the living room and he sees that the coffee table and the floral arrangement are intact and they're in the right area. And so Darlie says, well, this intruder came into this space where the couch and the coffee table and this floral arrangement that was set on top of the coffee table, this is the area where this crime took place. And it's all perfect. Nothing's been knocked over, including the floral arrangement. So again, Cron believes that Darlie had staged the kitchen area and there was no struggle to be seen in the living room.
It reacts with the iron in blood, not the hemoglobin. Damn it.
Isn't hemoglobin iron?
I don't know.
Jones, where are you?
I'm here. I don't know.
Okay. Two people that have been to medical school don't know. It's fine. It's fine. Well, let's go ahead and move on to floors because that's super exciting. But they are going to show a map that we have referred to of where everyone's DNA kind of ends up in the bottom story of the Routier home. So they look at the laundry room floor, the family room floor, and it all shows low velocity blood evidence, showing that Darlie, because a lot of this blood came from Darlie, that Darlie was moving slowly through this area, although her story states that she was, quote, chasing the intruder, which would have made directional, like we talked about earlier, it would have made directional movement. The blood evidence shows no medium or high velocity movement from any bleeder. So basically all of the blood that's found, except for maybe a few, show circular drops or it shows low velocity movement. And so Darlie's story was that she had chased the intruder out of the home, which should have left higher velocity blood splatter, but it didn't. So let's get into footprints. The prosecution argues that only Darlie could have left bloody footprints if she had cut her feet on the broken wine glass we discussed earlier, and she has no cuts to her feet. The prosecution suggests that the existence of the bloody footprints disproved her claims about an intruder entering the home because the blood was mixed with her blood and the boys. And Jones, me and Johnson were talking about this yesterday, and we really couldn't figure it out. What do you think the prosecution is thinking here? I'm really confused because no one else has cuts to their feet. The officers testify that the glass was fairly secluded to a small area and was easy to walk around. And so I don't understand why people say, oh, well, Darlie didn't have any cuts to the bottom of her feet. Therefore, like what? Are they trying to say she would have only made bloody footprints if she had stepped in the glass? Because to me that doesn't make sense because everyone in the house is bleeding and she's walking all over the place. So she's carrying blood.
She may not have had any cuts to her feet, but she did traipse through the mixtures of her and Damon's blood.
And if her neck is slit, then she herself
is bleeding herself, of course. That makes sense. The other thing that I think plays an important part, and you're getting to it in your next paragraph, is They find pairs of Reeboks in the foyer. One's Darren's, one's Darlie's. They both have blood splatter on them. They think from Darlie puts the Reeboks on, she runs
the sock
the
down.
sock down the alley, comes back, takes her Reeboks off, and that's what they find in the foyer.
So if you're a follower of this case and you believe that Darlie is guilty, can you send us an email and explain the whole cuts on the feet thing? Because I'm not sure how this theory got adopted and how it really plays into this.
Well, I think another big point is that her bloody footprints were underneath the vacuum.
Right. So she has to be bleeding before that vacuum is
Gets
tossed.
moved.
So, like Joan said, the Reeboks show that blood splatter was on Darlie and Darren's Reeboks, but that is because Darlie ran the sock down the alley. The prosecution never states why there's blood on Darren's. They only bring up the picture and the fact that Darlie's shoes that were left by the front door do have blood splatter on them. And again, Bevel is not a blood splatter expert. He's only a blood expert, blood analyst. I think that they should have called in a blood splatter analyst. So let's get into fingerprints. We've already talked about the infamous 2 prints, the one that was found on the laundry room / garage door, and the one that's found on the sofa table behind Devin's body. So why don't you go ahead and introduce us to our next character, Johnson, who is Hamilton.
So Hamilton is a newbie fingerprint expert for Rowlett PD. And that's all I have to say about him.
Yeah, he really hasn't worked that many cases. The prosecution calls him a quote-unquote fingerprint expert, and there's going to be several extraneous prints that he really can't account for. So he's going to take latent prints, which are what, Johnson?
Actually, I think you should do this because you know better than I do.
So a latent print is a print that you can't see. And so that's why they bring out the black powder and their little brushes. He is going around the residence and he's taking his brush and his powder and he takes 16 prints that are talked about during the trial. He takes latent prints from the house that have never been matched. He takes 5 off the windowsill in the garage that the quote-unquote intruder supposedly enters and exits from. He takes 1 off the sliding glass door that led directly from the backyard into the family room, which is where the family was found dead, or at least the 2 boys and Darlie were attacked in. He finds 2 from the door from the garage into the laundry room. Of course, he said that 1 was a partial that was left in wet blood. And then he takes another 16 prints in total. I have counted 10 that they talk about in the trial, but I'm not quite sure where the other 6 are found or if they were possibly matched to somebody. I've done quite a bit of research into fingerprints, like latent versus patent prints, and latent prints, again, like I said, are prints that are left that you cannot see. A patent print is left in something, most of the time blood if we're talking about a crime, but it could be left in paint, it could be left in glue, and a latent print will last about 30 days considering conditions, because a latent print is left by the oil in your fingers and that will evaporate within about 30 days depending on the conditions. Like we talked about early, if it's humid, which it is in Dallas, that latent print will last longer than somewhere that it's really dry and that it would evaporate in. And so if it lasts about 30 days and they take 16 prints, we also have to take into account that Darlie and Helena had cleaned that week. Probably a lot of the countertops and places that you would find fingerprints had been cleaned. So I'm going to touch quickly on the DNA. Again, we've mentioned the DNA map 1,000 times. I think that's the best way to sum it up. The prosecution states that 99% of the blood match the Routiers and state the blood is quote-unquote mixed, which we inferred means that, say, Darlie and Devin and Naaman's blood in some cases were all mixed together. But when Jones presents her side of the story, she will have a different definition than the prosecution has. Quickly, I'm going to talk about the neighbors. Two in particular, one named Nelda Watts. She is an elderly neighbor that lives across the street. She's going to testify only during the punishment phase of the trial. So Darlie has already been found guilty by her jury, and now they're coming back to figure out if they are going to sentence her to however many years, if they're going to sentence her to life, or if they're going to sentence her to death row for a capital case. So Nelda says that she does see this black car in the neighborhood quite a few times. She also says that the morning before Darlie is arrested, she sees Darlie and Darren throwing mementos that family and friends had left around the fountain in front of the house, and that they were playing a happy, quote unquote, game of catch of sorts. Darlie was throwing mementos at Darren like she was playing basketball, and then Darren was throwing them into the trunk of the car. There has been a lot of speculation about this. Nelda has dementia. Her daughter helps with her care. She's not exactly sure what day that this occurs. She doesn't know for sure if it's Darlie or if it could have been Dana, her sister. Another neighbor that we're going to talk about, I'll touch on him here, and then Jones is going to talk about him. But his name is William Gorsuch, and I mispronounced his name in the first episode, so I apologize. So Gorsuch is called forward by the prosecution, but really his testimony is going to go in the defense's favor. But William Gorsuch is basically going to testify to the same events that the police and other witnesses do that early the morning of the murders. This basically sums up the forensics and the theory that the prosecution puts forward in the case against Darlie Routier. If you can't tell, most of these quote-unquote experts have worked together. They have worked on cases together. They're all friends. The prosecution and the defense are all friends. They go to the same parties. They run in the same circles. They're friends with the judge. And so it's really difficult to understand if this type of relationship affects Darlie's trial, because it seems like they're all on the same side. So I wonder if they have a bias, which we will get into in later episodes, especially in our conspiracy. Probably it'll be our last episode. As I was doing some research, I just want you guys to know that the state of Texas has executed 1,567 people since Georgia versus Furman. And remember, in the beginning of this episode, we talked about Henry Wade. His name might sound familiar to you. And again, he runs in the same circles that the rest of these experts run in. Him and Cron are pretty good friends. Well, I'm just going to hand it over to Jones, and she is going to explain who Wade is, because you all know the name, although you might not recognize it out of context.
So Henry Wade was the district attorney in Dallas County for years and years and years. And when it came time to take the 1969, maybe 70 ruling on Roe versus Wade that gave women the right to abortion in the United States, Wade was the prosecutor, and that's why you recognize his name. I think he's died since then, but he was instrumental. I believe he was even district attorney when Kennedy was shot. So a lot of high-profile cases there for Henry Wade.
So in the next episode, Jones is going to do what I just did. So hang tight, because we're going to be back soon. So in conclusion, the prosecution never thought that an intruder entered the Routier home. As I stated, in the backyard, there showed no evidence that an intruder went through the gate or jumped over the fence or even walked through the backyard. There's no evidence that anybody went through the window. There is no evidence outside of the home except the sock, which we will get into in Jones's episode. The inside of the home shows an unclear picture of what happened. Did everything just become convoluted and it was it's really a hard case to put together because you can argue almost any piece of evidence to either side. But the prosecution is going to put forward again that no intruder went through the backyard, no intruder came through the kitchen. All of the tests that they do with the knives come back and show that the knife that was found in the Routier home is what cut the window, that the intruder, quote unquote, never threw a knife down on the laundry room floor, that Darlie's 911 call is suspect, that Darlie's wounds are superficial, the position of certain items in the house, like we talked about the coffee table and the vacuum, the position of the boys upon their death, as if Damon was possibly running away from somebody, Darlie's t-shirt, the pillow, and testimony that places the intruder at the home. Everything that's been collected, analyzed, and talked about only points to one person, and that person is Darlie Routier. Darlie is guilty of killing 2 young boys, her own children, and she must be found guilty to uphold the standards in the state and in our country. In this episode, we have discussed Darlie's guilt and that Darlie is most likely the perpetrator and that there was no intruder in the Routier home that night. In the next episode, Jones is going to do the same thing, but she is going to present the defense's side of this, and she is going to poke holes in all of the information that I provided you guys with today. So hang tight. We will be back soon with Darlie, another installment of Darlie. And we're going to try and get that episode out quickly to you guys so that you can listen to these 2 episodes back to back so that it makes a little bit more sense. In the meantime, if you guys have any questions, if you guys want to weigh in on this case, if you guys have found information outside of this or can answer any of the questions that we had, please shoot us an email. Remember, our email is kitchen.table.research@gmail.com. We hope you guys have a safe and wonderful day, and we will be back with Darlie Part 4. Dun dun dun. Do you guys have anything else to say before we sign off?
Yeah. So, for anyone that's commenting on our social media, we just like to ask that you be respectful of victims, regardless of whether or not you think they were involved or deserved it or whatever. So, just be respectful, please.
Love all of our fans, and we hope that you guys stay well. And again, if you are having thoughts of suicidal ideation, or if you are thinking about attempting suicide, please call the Christ line. And I think that's it.
We'll be in yours soon.